And then, excellent, we're in progress. And then I'm going to pass this over to the chair of Circular Action Alliance Board of Directors, Charlie Schwartz. Go
Thanks,
ahead, Charlie.
Olivia. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for being here. I serve as the board chair for Circular Action Alliance and also as the packaging sustainability director for Keurig Dr. Pepper. EPR for printed paper and packaging continues to be top of mind for many of us and stakeholders in the US. If you're here today, it's likely that the new laws in Colorado, Oregon, California, and Maine are impacting your organization in some way as those laws evolve into regulation. It's the reason that a group of proactive producers that now number at 17, composed of leading brands and retailers, formed CAA earlier this year. It's the nation's first nonprofit to handle printed paper and packaging, and we're formed with a very singular purpose: develop a world-class producer responsibility organization to serve the needs of producers, but also comply with the requirements of these evolving individual state EPR regulations. This has really been no small feat and has been over a year in the making. We have an expert project team that you'll hear from today and a very engaged board of directors at the national level, but also evolving at the state level, as you'll hear from Darla today. As a national nonprofit, we're really seeking to drive efficiencies in these programs while meeting the needs of state level needs specifically. Ultimately, we want to enhance recycling and product recyclability while building consumer trust in a more resilient and improved recycling system in the areas where we're operating. Over the next 90 minutes, you'll hear much more about our plans from that expert project team. And our intention is that this will be the first in a series of presentations and conversations that will give all of the stakeholders for each of these EPR laws visibility into our work and open up new lines of communication. Thanks again for taking the time to join us today, and I'm going to hand it back over to Olivia and Shane to move on with the presentation.
Thanks very much, Charlie. I'm seeing a few questions in our info mailbox and in the chat just related to the recording. For those who are joining late, we are recording this session. We will make the presentation portion available after the presentation. I'm going to ask my colleague Mark to pull up our slides, please. And I'm going to quickly, yep, the agenda is great. Thanks, Mark. So I'm just going to give us a quick snapshot of where we're going over the next hour and a bit. I'm going to start by walking us through a bit of background on what EPR is, what the role of the PRO is in implementing EPR laws. We'll talk a little bit about how Circular Action Alliance was formed, and then my colleague Shane will tell you more about the structure of Circular Action Alliance and our vision. Then we're going to hear from our special guest, Darla from CDPHE, who's going to talk through the main requirements of the Colorado law, the progress that has been made to date over a very short period of time, and what lies ahead. We'll then have my colleague Peter, who's our Colorado program manager, talk about next steps with the Colorado needs assessment specifically. So, a key element of the next phase of implementation. And then I'll wrap up with a summary of our next steps across the other states before we move to Q&A. So next slide, please, Mark. We'll get right into it. Oh, and the one after that. Thank you. So this presentation is not designed to be an EPR 101 session, but we did want to provide just a bit of context on the laws that have passed and the role that CAA is stepping into in Colorado to start with, and potentially in other states. As many of you probably know, EPR is a policy approach that requires companies that make or distribute certain products, in the case that we're talking about today, packaging, makes those companies responsible for financing and operation of programs that manage those products at end of life. So the US has had some EPR laws in place for some time, laws covering products such as paint, mattresses, electronics, batteries. However, EPR for packaging is relatively new to the US, and we will see the nation's first packaging EPR laws implemented in the coming years, and that's very much the substance of our conversation today. I should note here that Canada and Europe are a bit ahead of the US in establishing and implementing packaging EPR laws. And in a minute, we'll speak to how CAA's founding members' experiences globally played a role in informing the model that CAA has developed, as well as some of the lessons learned from those other American EPR programs and product stewardship experiences. But to go back to what EPR does, it does shift the responsibility for funding and in some cases, managing recycling programs from local governments and taxpayers to the producers. So covered materials vary from state to state, as does the definition of producer. But generally speaking, the producers are the brand owners, the retailers, the restaurants that distribute or sell packaging and paper, covered paper into the market. And if those brand owners cannot be identified, then it is the first importer of those covered materials that generally has the obligations. Darla has a great slide that she's going to go through shortly that provides additional guidance for companies working to determine whether or not they are a producer in Colorado. So stay tuned on that specifically. But as anyone who's been looking at these laws know, no two laws are exactly the same, although there are some common elements. So under EPR laws, producers pay fees to fund the cost of collecting, sorting, and processing the covered material that they put into the market, primarily to support residential waste management programs. And depending on the law, they also fund other aspects such as consumer education and outreach, infrastructure improvements, and end market development. Fees are based on the cost of managing the material you put into the market, as we've said, and baked into that fee structure are incentives that can encourage producers to make packaging design choices that minimize waste and improve recyclability or other environmentally friendly attributes. So packaging EPR was first signed into law in the US in 2021, and we now have 4 states that have enacted laws creating packaging EPR programs and obligations for producers. This past legislative session, you saw several states pass what are essentially study bills that establish a process for making recommendations to state legislatures for future EPR bills. And additionally, New York is doing a needs assessment that is proceeding without a packaging EPR law yet on the books. Next slide, please. So what is a producer responsibility organization? What is our role? Under most US EPR laws for paper and packaging, a producer responsibility organization or a PRO, those are all the same thing. It's a producer-led, typically nonprofit organization that provides producers with compliance services to help them meet their obligations under the laws. So all of the states that have passed the packaging EPR laws in the US require the formation of a PRO. Some do allow producers to comply with individual compliance plans. And all of the states except for Oregon only appoint one PRO at the beginning of the program. So Oregon does allow for multiple PROs. So far, only Colorado has made that appointment, and you'll hear a little bit more about that today. Generally, a PRO is responsible for developing a program plan for managing covered products, which is reviewed by the relevant government agency. In some cases, state advisory boards play a role in that review and approval process. And then importantly, collecting and managing the producer fees that allow the PRO to go ahead and implement that plan. PROs may also be referred to as stewardship organizations. In Maine, it is an SO or stewardship organization that will be selected by the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. So as I mentioned, CAA has been selected as the PRO in Colorado. We do intend to apply to be the PRO and submit program plans in other states with EPR laws. Shane will say more about that and how we're intending to structure ourselves in just a minute. But before we get into that, I wanted to provide a quick glimpse into how CAA formed in response to these laws and the obligations that you see here on the screen. So next slide, please, Mark. Charlie spoke to this in the opening, but this work began a little over a year ago with the support of the Recycling Partnership, who acted as a convener of companies that were interested in exploring the feasibility of creating a PRO. Over the second half of last year, the Recycling Partnership incubated this work, and they brought together a group of consultants, many of whom have direct experience setting up PROs and developing and implementing program plans in the Canadian provinces, as well as others with experience from the US legislative process. There were 16 companies that participated in regular meetings over the second half of last year and ultimately developed the structure and financing needed to launch this organization. And we formally incorporated at the end of this past year, at the end of 2022. So as Charlie noted, these companies were motivated to act early to to ensure that the new packaging EPR laws could succeed in furthering a circular economy. And with them, these companies brought significant expertise with other EPR programs, particularly global programs, to the organization. So what you see here is our official group of founding members. You can see we've got sectors from food to personal care products to retail represented. We are very pleased to have these companies on board. Very grateful for their leadership. But with that said, I think we appreciate that, and that these founding members appreciate that ultimately this is an organization that's going to represent thousands of producers. And we look forward to providing those companies with more opportunities to hear from us and provide input into our work. So with that, I am going to kick it over to my colleague Shane to tell us a little bit more about CAA's structure and vision.
Thank you very much, Olivia. So you can go to the next slide, Mark. So Circular Action Alliance, as has been pointed out, is a nonprofit producer responsibility organization. And really the mission of CAA is to provide the best-in-class compliance services for producers across multiple states. We know that producers have, are responding to different EPR requirements in different states. And so having a national services organization that can support producers with that compliance and to provide consistency across states is important to make sure that we can reduce burden and support producers with, common compliance tools and resources, such as a common reporting platform or a portal for producers to report supply data into for the purposes of fee setting. At a local level, our priority is on implementing program plans that meet the requirements of state EPR statutes, but also enhance recycling systems and, advance innovation in different types of, reuse and refill systems, as well as is required in Colorado and in California. We're balancing, in the structure here, the need for local representation and operations through the implementation of different state EPR programs, but providing those services across multiple jurisdictions to support producers, particularly with their reporting obligations. You can go to the next slide. So that's a vision that we have, and we started with the producer working group process was harmonization as much as possible for the services that will be delivered across multiple states, and really taking a look at how to get optimal outcomes out of recycling systems through enhancement of collection infrastructure, standardization as much as you can with a standard list of materials so that we can really ramp up promotion and education, reduce contamination in the system, and to make sure that we're reducing some of the residual waste coming out of material recovery facilities to get more material that is able to be recycled and reincorporated into recycled content to really build the circular economy. Efficiency is, of course, a core focus of the organization to make sure that we're running the systems as cost effectively as possible while advancing innovation. And then, as Charlie noted at the beginning, we need to really support consumers with comprehensive promotion and education to make sure that we're optimizing systems. The other key aspect of what we've been working on is it's a collaborative effort in the different states, California, Colorado, Maine, and Oregon, that have implemented extended producer responsibility laws. And so we recognize the need to, of course, provide the necessary compliance services to producers, but also to collaborate with different value chain partners to make sure that we are delivering the best possible recycling system for each of the states. So specifically in Colorado, we are focused right now on the needs assessment. Peter is going to get into that a bit more with the group once we talk a little bit more about that. But first, we can turn it back to Olivia for just a quick introduction, and then we'll have Darla, our guest speaker, speak about the different state requirements in Colorado.
Thanks so much, Shane. And I will do just a quick intro to Darla. Darla is the EPR lead for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Sorry, Mark, we can go to the next slide. She is heading up the implementation efforts over at the department and has prepared some slides for us today to explain the law in a little bit further detail, show the progress that has been made to date, and give us a bit of a picture of where we're going. So we're very excited to have her here today. She's been a tremendous partner. Thanks for joining, Darla, and over to you.
All right, thanks, Olivia. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to present a quick overview of Colorado's EPR for packaging and paper products law. So if you're not familiar, our Producer Responsibility Program for Statewide Recycling Act, or House Bill 22-1355, was signed into law on June 3rd, 2022, so just last year. And since then, we've been working expeditiously to develop and implement the law as quickly as possible. Next slide. Back one more. Thank you. So aside from the circular economy being a major driver in EPR programs, as Shane mentioned earlier, there's a variety of other factors which include the need for increased recycling rates, especially since Colorado is currently at a staggering 16% recycle rate. But there's also the need for stabilized recycling markets, more sustainable packaging design, equitable access to services throughout the state, a stable funding for infrastructure improvement throughout the state, consistency in recycling guidelines. So meeting these goals will support the development of local end markets and provide that foundation for building a circular economy in Colorado. Next. So next I'll explain who the producers or the obligated parties are. In Colorado, we have a tiered definition for determining who is obligated as a producer, and that begins with the manufacturer, the brand owners, and the trademark licensees. And then from there it flows to distributors, e-commerce packagers, and publishers. Next. And we totally get it. We understand it can be confusing for a producer to initially understand whether they're obligated under the program. So in order to help you figure that out, we created a producer flow chart, which is shown here on this slide. And you'll see in step one, it walks you through a series of questions that can help you understand if you are in fact considered a producer in Colorado. Next. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, and then if it is determined by answering those questions on step one that a company is in fact a producer, step two will then walk you through questions to determine whether you're exempt under Colorado's EPR exemptions, or if in fact you do need to participate. This flow chart can be found on our Colorado EPR website, which is included later in the slide deck, and it will be available to you after this webinar. Next slide. Thank you. So what's covered? What are the covered materials? The packages and the products we're talking about are very similar to the other 3 EPR states, but Colorado's EPR includes packaging materials that are consumer facing and they're intended for single use, regardless of their recyclability, and includes materials such as paper, plastic, glass, metal, cartons, flexible foam, rigid packaging, or other materials, or a combination of those materials. So if you think about all the packaging when you walk into a store that you can purchase, that is not what we call a durable or a reusable product, and that is not intended for a reuse or a refill, all of that is included. It actually does not include the back end of the store though. So also any business to business materials are not included. And we'll talk a little bit about exemptions here in a minute. And then paper products means paper and other cellulosic fibers, whether or not they are used as a medium for text or images. This could include flyers, brochures, booklets, catalogs, telephone directories, newspapers, magazines, and paper used for writing or any other purpose. Next. So I won't talk through these next 3 material exemption slides in a lot of detail for time's sake today mostly, but I have included them here as a resource for you for future reference. But really quickly though, I'll say that if you think of the materials that are federally regulated for health and safety are generally exempt under Colorado's law, and I think that's pretty standard across all of the EPR states. Next slide. And then continuing on with a few exemptions, I will just note really quickly on this first exemption listed here. So although the paper product itself is exempt in this first example, the packaging around that product is not exempt and it would be obligated under the program. So again, the slide's here. If you have questions about it, let me know, but it's there for your reference. Next slide. So those were the covered material exemptions, and now this slide will show you the producer exemptions, which are fairly straightforward and primarily focused around government and small business exemptions. So it's, again, slides here for your reference. I won't go into a lot of detail today. Next slide. So although there are 4 states with EPR for packaging and paper products, Colorado is unique in that we kind of have the most traditional EPR model out of the 4 states. So in some other EPR schemes, they may have varying degrees of financial or operational responsibility for the producers. But that said, since our program is mandatory and it's 100% producer-led, 100% producer-funded, and the producer responsibility organization is 100% responsible for compliance with the law, these are the factors that make it the most traditional EPR scheme for packaging in the US. And we're also unique in that we have the shortest timeline from bill passage to program implementation with the fewest staff of all the states. But all that said, Colorado is blazing the trail for EPR packaging and paper products implementation in the US, and we were the first state to appoint our pro. Next slide. So although the pro has a lot of responsibilities in our program, just as I mentioned, the CDPHE or the department still has quite a bit of statutory responsibility. This includes appointing and administering the advisory board, appointing the PRO or the pro, approving the third-party contractor for the needs assessment, managing the public input processes for the needs assessment and the pro plan proposal, presenting the needs assessment and plan recommendation to the Joint Budget Committee, designating the final plan, developing an eco-modulation bonus schedule, overseeing the program, enforcement and penalties, developing rules and regulations, which the Solid and Hazardous Waste Commission promulgates, and providing annual legislative reports, as well as conducting a consumer cost impact analysis no less than every 3 years. Next slide. So these next, this slide will provide you with sort of a condensed version of our timeline. So all these actions shown in green are already accomplished, so we are moving right along. This includes forming the advisory board, hosting our first advisory board meeting, completing the first rulemaking and the associated stakeholder input process, appointing the producer responsibility organization, Circular Action Alliance, who you're meeting today, the pro issuing the RFP for the statewide needs assessment, the department issuing an RFP for facilitation services for our advisory board meetings, and the pro and the department's approval of the needs assessment consultants. Next slide. So I'm a big fan of celebrating successes along the way, so I just want to share a few wins we've had already just in our first year. First, we've been meeting our targets ahead of statutory deadlines, and that includes the appointing of the advisory board and hosting the first meeting. And as you all are aware now, Colorado was the first state in the nation to appoint a pro for packaging and paper. Even with starting a year later than a couple of the other states on program authorization. So that was a big achievement. And we have also approved the third-party contractor for the needs assessment ahead of schedule as well. Next, we successfully facilitated the collaboration between the pro and the advisory board regarding the needs assessment scope of work. The advisory board submitted its recommendations, of which many were incorporated by the pro. Our first rulemaking was successfully promulgated, and that was regarding the annual Consumer Price Index or CPI adjustment for producers with an annual total gross revenue of less than $5 million. And lastly, excuse me, our outreach to other EPR implementing states has been really successful, and that we're meeting regularly, and we've developed a working sheet of all the potential areas where we could harmonize our forward packaging EPR bills. So we've not only been collaborating with implementing states, but also with the PRO, with Product Stewardship Institute, and with other countries with packaging EPR that Olivia had mentioned, such as Canada and France. And there's been ongoing collaboration work with the other 14 states who are actively trying to pass packaging EPR. And again, that is to emphasize the importance of consistency amongst the states with packaging and paper products EPR. Next slide. So on this slide, all the items in red are upcoming, with the needs assessment being due in January 2024. So that's not too far ahead in time. The individual program plan notices are due in January as well. Our presentation with the recommended scenario to the Joint Budget Committee happens in March 2024. The second rulemaking, which is for our primary regs, will happen in May of 2024. I should say anticipated in May of 2024, of which we anticipate the stakeholder process beginning this November 2023. And then the program plan is due in February 2025, and producers must join the PRO by June of 2025. We project to have the third rulemaking regarding eco-modulation in November 2025, with the stakeholder process anticipated to commence in early 2025 for that. And then finally, the program plan implementation is projected to begin in January 2026, or within 6 months of department approval, whichever comes first there. So it's going to be a very busy couple of years. And next slide. So if you're interested in being a part of any of those processes that I just mentioned, or you just want to follow our program development and implementation, you can scan the first QR code to be taken to our EPR website, or you can scan the second QR code to visit our rulemaking page, and you can be added to our listserv by sending an email to eprcomments@state.co.us. And you can receive our monthly updates and notification, and I promise there's no spam. That's the end of my presentation for today, and I will stick around to answer any questions that come up for later. But for now, I'm going to turn it back over, I believe, to Pete to talk about next steps for CAA.
Thanks so much, Darla. I really appreciate you providing that background on the legislation. Just quickly before I get into the Colorado implementation, I know there's a number of questions still being asked. I know the team is helping to answer some of those, and we'll deal with some of them at the end of the presentation as well, making sure to save some time for those questions to be answered. So as mentioned, CAA was appointed the PRO about 4 months ago now, but our work on preparing began much earlier than that. We understood that in Colorado, in order to meet the requirements of the regulation, we needed to do a lot of work in advance. Next slide over. Next slide, Mark. Yeah, perfect. So the first real step in Colorado was the implementation of producer responsibility was the development of a needs assessment, which is prescribed in the legislation. The needs assessment is really an in-depth study that will assess Colorado's existing recycling system and identify opportunities for growth and improvement of that system. It's really meant to provide the roadmap for the approved PRO's program plan, and also help to inform the rulemaking process. I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about some of the various elements that will be looked at as part of the needs assessment. So the first area is access to servicing. So this would include a look at what residents' current access is to curbside, depot, or other types of recycling services across the state. Looking at performance currently of those recycling programs. So for example, the amount of materials collected, estimated composition breakdown, participation and set out rates, and really understanding where there are gaps in recycling services that may exist within the state. The next area is recycling services costs. So those could be incurred by either private or public service providers to provide recycling services to residential covered entities. And that might look differently across the state, and may also look different based on what type of service level that is being provided. Again, whether that might be curbside or depot related. The needs assessment will also look at demographic factors and other variables that might impact things like what the reimbursement rates are, looking at recycling or contamination rates within the state, promotion and education, how that is delivered across the state, and also things like environmental justice considerations that may need to be taken into account. The needs assessment will also look at levels of contamination at MRFs and compost facilities throughout the state, and the impacts of contamination on those facilities, what factors might influence contamination rates, and how they might impact both costs and outcomes, so recyclate that's being produced. We'll also look at non-residential service availability, gaps and costs. So specifically related to recycling services that might be provided to hospitality locations, public spaces, state and local governments, and schools. It will look at processing capacity. So we want to understand what is the available capacity to manage different types of materials within the state, what those facilities might be accepting or excluding from processing. What is the nature of the processing capacity? So is it single stream, dual, or is it source separated bale and ship? What are some of the current throughputs that is happening through those facilities, and what might their ability to accept more materials be? Understanding what the current equipment and sorting processes are, and what also are some of the inbound and outbound compositions with those materials. I also know we've had a few questions in advance of the webinar about non-traditional packaging, such as things like cylinders, packaging that might contain household hazardous materials. And we are looking, as part of the needs assessment, at the processing capacity that might be available in Colorado as well for those materials. For opportunities and costs, we're going to be looking at the various types of service methods to increase recycling rates overall for different types of materials. So looking at what additional curbside or depot servicing might look like for residential sources or some of those non-residential sources. We'll be looking at, as well at a minimum recyclables list, so the development of criteria to assess various materials for inclusion in a list that might be collected in different geographic regions, either through curbside, depot, both, or potentially through some other types of means. We'll also be looking conversely at a proposed exclusion list with rationale for the exclusion of those materials. We'll be looking at market conditions, opportunities for use of those recycled materials in the state and in different areas of the state, looking at transportation gaps and opportunities affecting access to those markets. We'll be looking at innovative technologies, better understanding what technologies may be able to improve some of the current outcomes, whether that be collection, sorting, or recycling technologies to improve on the current performance levels. There is a requirement to look at reuse and refill, so the availability and scope of any reuse or refill systems in the state that might affect the use of covered materials. We'll be looking to better understand the nature and extent of education within the state. So by different types of providers, so private and public, and how they might be trying to deal with things like contamination, improving participation rates, and litter prevention. So really what we're trying to do in that side is look at what are the best practices out there and how might they be able to improve performance across the state. We will be looking at a number of scenarios. So this is sort of a culmination of the work done through those elements. So we'll be establishing at least 3 different scenarios for increasing collection and recycling rates, setting the targets for the state that they could meet by January 2030 and January 2035, and the operating and capital costs needed to reach each of those scenarios. And finally, I know we've had a few questions around compost facilities. We will be looking as part of the needs assessment at the processing capacity for compost facilities in a similar manner to what we'll be doing for recycling facilities. But this will specifically look at how facilities in Colorado might be able to process and recover compostable materials, and that might be either fiber-based or plastic-based compostables. So it's a significant amount of work that we're undertaking. We do know that there are significant gaps in available data currently in Colorado. That's not specific to Colorado. Most jurisdictions struggle with similar types of data deficiencies. Next slide over, Mark. So really to deal with that, we've been developing a work plan for Colorado and the RFP for the needs assessment since February of this year. We understood we had no guarantees of being selected as the pro, but we knew the only way to meet the timeline set in the legislation was to plan ahead. So we did get an RFP out early. We got a RFP out in May. The submission deadline was June 30th. We are just in the process of looking to finalize the agreement with the preferred vendor and expect to announce that shortly. The work of the vendor will include a significant amount of primary research, so surveys, interviews, site visits, and secondary research as well, review of different types of reports that may be available on various other data sources that may be available. Once the decision is made around, an announcement has been made around the vendor, we will work throughout the process to ensure that stakeholders like all of you included on the webinar today are informed, and we will be looking to ensure that we seek feedback throughout that process. So there are a few ways we're going to be doing that. There is the Colorado State Advisory Board meetings. Those are all posted on CDPHE's website. We will be looking obviously through the vendors with direct engagement, and we have started to meet with some stakeholders ourselves as part of the CAA project team. We will be looking at working group meetings like this, and obviously select opportunities for engagement. So things like conferences where we can meet directly with stakeholders. Next slide over. So this is really meant to just sort of provide a bit of an outline of the work undertaken to date with CDPHE, with the Colorado Advisory Board, CAA's Colorado State Board. So, you know, as you can see on the slide, we have completed now, I've almost completed the award process for the RFP. We will then be working closely with the vendor to assist in their work to ensure all stakeholders are properly updated and feedback sought. So we will be working closely with the vendor on the time throughout that process. It is a very tight timeline to get the amount of work that's needed in the needs assessment done by January of next year. And we know we will have to lean heavily on various stakeholders to get feedback as we move through this process. Next slide over. So as I mentioned, we know there are significant data gaps for Colorado for most of the elements that I walked through. The selected vendor does have a developed approach to address some of those gaps, but we do know we need to work closely with all of you to identify data sources, to get additional contacts. So if there are any bits of information that you think might be helpful to this work as we move forward in Colorado, we really do recommend you to reach out. If you've got information you can share with us ahead of time, we would be very appreciative of that information. So the Circular Action Alliance website or email address, the general email address is included in the slide. That all the messages that go through to us are triaged to different project team members. So you're not going into a void. You will get your message returned as quickly as possible. Next slide over. And I think I'm heading over back to you, Olivia.
That's back to me. Thanks so much, Pete. And thanks to you all for the great questions in the chat. We've been in the Q&A. We've been trying to answer them as we go. We're reserving a few to address verbally at the end. And like I said, if there's anything we don't get to today, we'll have a record of it and we'll be able to address that and follow up. So just a few next steps for other states that I think I'll mention. I'll probably skip over that Colorado update, as you just heard about that in much more detail than I have here. But as we've mentioned at several points over the course of this presentation, we are working to be approved as the PRO in other states and doing the necessary work as a prospective pro to ensure that we are well prepared to meet the requirements of the different laws and support producers and other stakeholders post-approval. We've been deeply engaged in the informal rulemaking process in California to that end, and we anticipate that CalRecycle will be releasing the pro application this fall, is what we've heard, and that application is due January 1st of 2024. Again, California, like Colorado, will only approve one pro at the outset of the program. Oregon conversely allows for the possibility of multiple pros. We've mentioned that once before. And the application process is slightly different in that to be approved as a pro in Oregon, you must represent or have producers that represent at least 10% of the market, and as well as submit program plans. So those program plans are due in March of 2024. And a pro is approved with DEQ's approval of those plans. So meeting the market share threshold and having your program plans approved makes you a pro in Oregon. We have been in regular contact with Oregon Department of Environmental Quality and participating in the rulemaking process. We have been appointed to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee for phase 2 of the rulemaking in Oregon, and are hard at work already on those program plans. We are engaged in the main rulemaking process and anticipate that formal rulemaking will begin in Maine at the end of this year. Maine's timeline for approving a pro is a bit further out, with the state putting out an RFP for their stewardship organization, SO they call it in Maine, in the fall of 2025, I believe. Next slide, please. We noted earlier a handful of states that had passed study bills this past session. Maryland is among those states and is a bit unique in that their bill calls for the appointment of a pro to play a role in the analysis and development of a future legislative proposal. So we are following that process and the next steps in Maryland closely. Obviously, it's not guaranteed that the pro that is selected to participate in that process would ultimately be the pro selected to administer a program if and when Maryland passes a law that establishes a program. But again, we are very interested in intending to apply to be the pro as part of that process this year. And then generally, many of you may have heard from us or seen us or gotten on this invitation list because we have been doing a lot of outreach to both national and state level organizations, traders organizations representing producers, representing suppliers and converters and other stakeholders across the EPR landscape. That outreach will continue. This is, again, our first sort of come one, come all presentation, but in many ways isn't a substitute for some of those industry-specific conversations. So we very much look forward to continuing to engage with you in those forums. And we know that this has to be a collaborative process. We need to be consulting with a range of stakeholders. Pete alluded to that in the context of the needs assessment process, but it's certainly going to be a key ingredient to the success of our programs in each of these states. I will say that we envision today's webinars as the first in a series and the first of many regular updates to all those that are interested in following our progress and continuing to ask us questions. We are also in the process of building out our website and adding more information to continue to be a resource on what's going on state to state and with CAA for this group. As well as contemplating, are there smaller producer-focused forums that we can set up to give those. Just looking at the very specific questions that we have in the chat here, it's sort of a good reason why we would want to have some producer-focused conversations, and really that would enable us to keep you posted as some of the very complex topics, many of which have yet to be determined through either rulemaking or our own program planning process, starts to get addressed. So consider this in the opening of the communication channels in many ways, and the start of a dialogue that we'd like to continue, both as a large group here, but certainly one-on-one as you all have interest and would like to engage with us more deeply. Next slide, please. And that is it. That is, we've made really good time here. We've got our contact information up on this slide. I want to talk about Q&A in just a second. Maybe we'll stop the recording here. I want to give people a chance to get this information down. And I did see one request in the chat